Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 2012 Planners Debate to discuss the future Metropolis, regional or local. This is HUPO's, I guess you might say, that our seminal event of the year. And before I turn it over to our panelists, I just wanted to say a few thank yous and remarks to open. I'd like to thank, first of all of the HUPO officers who have helped make this event come together. Specifically, Emily Mikowitz, who has put in tireless energy as our HUPO Planners Debate liaison this year. Of course, we'd like to thank our panelists. This event was actually scheduled for April, and we, at the last second, moved it up to March due to a scheduling snafu. And they were all generously reshuffled their schedules, and they all came here tonight, so we look forward to a vigorous debate. Finally, I'd like to thank Anne Marie, our moderator tonight. Anne Marie is a Loeb Fellow at the GSD this year and actually brings a bit of experience in this topic herself here tonight. Anne Marie has led the Community Design Center of Pittsburgh, which is a nonprofit that improves the quality of life for residents through the design of the built environment. She has worked to bring prominent voices to the Pittsburgh planning community to foster a local dialogue on planning issues, and has also chaired the Pittsburgh Civic Design Coalition. Before I turn it over to Anne Marie to introduce our panelists, I'd like to just say a couple words about the topic tonight, because I think one of the biggest questions I've had coming in as we've been advertising this event is why this topic, why this year, and why a debate? And I think those are all good questions. The simple answer is that we voted on it. And by we, I mean the planning classes of 2012 and 2013. This was the selected topic out of 4 possible choices, albeit in a very close vote. So we're going to try to work some of the other topics into the debate to the extent that we can tonight. Obviously, I think the first part of the title of the debate is fairly self-explanatory. As aspiring urban planners, I think we're all interested in shaping the cities of tomorrow. But as to why we felt this was an issue of regional versus local, perhaps it's not an issue of versus. Perhaps it's simply a discussion to be had about different frameworks. But I think as we look at the discourse about cities of the future, we've stumbled into what right now might be viewed as kind of a fundamental dilemma of scale in planning. We're seeing a resurgence of interest in regional planning as cities grow, become more suburban and larger. Figures from Ed Glazer to Rem Koolhaas to Peter Calthorpe, you can go on, have all put forward hypotheses rooted in the crucial understanding that as cities become bigger, more technological, more suburban, at the scale of the metropolitan region that crosses multiple municipal lines has probably never before been as important as it is today. As this happens, we've also seen some pushback and a series of analytical responses that urge that in this age of technology, suburbanization, population growth, potential oil crises, and social media, that a renewed focus on physical localities, municipalities, and neighborhoods has also probably never been more important. And it's the crux of these two paradigms that I think really come to a head here tonight. And there have been a lot of ways these two different lines of thought have been manifested. Ideally, I think tonight we'd love to see a perfect resolution of these issues. That's probably unlikely. Regardless, though, we do look forward to a vigorous, energetic, and hopefully productive discussion. And with that, I'll turn it over to Anne Marie to introduce our 4 panelists, Armando Carbonell, Amy Cotter, Gerald Frug, and Robert Sampson.
Thank you, Roger, for your introduction and for inviting me to serve as your moderator for this evening's event. Before we begin, I thought I would share with you a couple of disclaimers. 1, I'm an architect, not a planner. And 2, as your moderator for this debate, I'm a bit of a consensus builder. So this idea of finding common ground is very important to me. I, while not a planner, have worked at a variety of different scales in Pittsburgh. As Roger mentioned, my work in private practice and community design has led to my participation in neighborhood, citywide, and regional planning efforts in Pittsburgh and southwestern Pennsylvania. Southwestern Pennsylvania, an area with a population of about 2.3 million people in 9 counties and over 500 municipalities, has the dubious distinction, according to Bruce Katz of the Brookings Institute, of being considered one of the worst sprawling areas of the country. This may seem surprising, but it's true when you take into consideration that unlike so many other sprawling metropolitan areas in our country, our region lost population rather than gained population over the last 50 years. So I've had an opportunity to see firsthand the lack of coordinated planning between coordinated planning between municipalities has drained population and businesses from existing urban centers and increased competition between communities. It's also added new infrastructure to communities that cannot afford to maintain the infrastructure we already have, and it's threatened our most precious assets, our natural resources, our land, and our cultural heritage. So in this case, metropolitan planning has failed. Throughout my career, I've also had the opportunity to see how working together has helped communities. My work throughout my career is focused on helping to engage people in the planning of the built environment, and whether designing a house for a family, a plan for a new facility or institution, or envisioning a community's future, I've started by involving a variety of people who know more than I do about the project, with the goal of gathering information and ideas, finding common ground, and building consensus, and therefore seeing the power of shared community-driven visions in transforming formerly blighted neighborhoods into economically, socially, and physically vibrant ones. So while I look forward to a spirited debate this evening, my goal is to find common ground. What ideas, issues, and practices can we identify tonight to help frame, focus, and inspire our work as we move forward? And what can we offer you, particularly those of you who are aspiring planners, in your work to help address this question of planning and the scale of planning? So according to the Regional Plan Association, the challenges of the 21st century require new ways of thinking about planning and infrastructure, governance, economic development, and social equity. As we all know, cities and other areas, not just urban ones, are rapidly changing. They're becoming more complex due to the introduction of new technology, global agendas, climate change, and increased competition for resources. In recent years, the GSD has focused on this issue with a series of conferences that have explored the changing nature of cities and how these changes require different approaches to planning and designing the physical environment. So two of tonight's panelists, Gerald and Robert, have participated in the Ethics of the Urban Conference that was hosted here earlier this month. So with this in mind, we turn back to the topic of this evening's debate. What is the ideal unit for thinking about the cities of tomorrow? Is planning regionally a realistic tool? Or has new regionalism brought with it a renewed need to focus in locally on the neighborhood scale? So tonight, HUPO, the Harvard Urban Planning Organization, has assembled a distinguished panel of local professionals in the fields of urban planning, policymaking, sociology, and law to address these questions. They bring knowledge gathered from academic research and theory, best practices, and leading local and national initiatives. They bring experience and perspectives from working at the neighborhood, the city, the regional, and the national scales. And needless to say, all of them care deeply about cities and planning. Before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to share a few notes about the format of tonight's event. I've asked each panelist to take a few minutes to make opening remarks that address the question of what is the ideal unit for planning in the context of their personal work and experience. Following those, we'll begin with questions gathered by HUPO in advance of the event. I'm sure many of you contributed to those questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. And before we conclude, I'll ask each panelist to take a few minutes to make closing comments. So now for the panelists. Starting on my far right, Robert Sampson is the Henry Ford II Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard University, as well as the Director of the Social Sciences Program at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Professor Sampson's research covers a variety of areas, including crime, disorder, the life course, neighborhood efforts, collective civic life, urban inequality, ecometrics, and the social structure of the city. He's the author of several books and numerous papers. The University of Chicago Press recently published Great American City, Chicago and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect, the culmination of his work as scientific director of the Project on Human Development in Chicago's Neighborhoods. In this work, Professor Sampson argues that communities still matter because life is decisively shaped by where people live and that neighborhoods influence a remarkably wide variety of social phenomenon, and that even national crises cannot halt the impact of place. Professor Sampson received his PhD from the State University of New York at Albany and his BA from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Next, Amy Cotter manages implementation at Greater Boston's regional plan, Metro Future, making a Greater Boston region, including its Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Grant and MACP's work as a member of the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance. In her role as Director of Regional Plan Implementation, her work uses public engagement, research, analysis, and advocacy to explore policy and planning options, develop best practices, and inform decision-making from local to national levels. Ms. Cotter brings to the effort over 15 years of leadership in planning and policy making for smart growth and sustainable development, and has held positions at the TELUS Institute and ICF Consulting. Her areas of expertise include building community and regional sustainability using public engagement, information, analysis, and advocacy. Ms. Cotter obtained master's degrees in regional planning and environmental policy from the University of Michigan and received her BA from Tufts University. Next, Gerald Frug is the Louis D. Brandeis Professor of Law at Harvard University and is a specialist in local government law, a subject he's taught for over 25 years. He's worked as special assistant to the chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Washington, D.C., and as health services administrator of the city of New York, before teaching at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and then joining the Harvard faculty in 1981. His research interests include legal problems of local governments and and he's published dozens of articles on these and other topics. Select publications include Citybound, How States Stifle Urban Innovation, Dispelling the Myth of Home Rule, Local Power in Greater Boston, and City Making, Building Communities Without Building Walls. Professor Frug holds a degree from the University of California at Berkeley and a law degree from Harvard Law School. And finally, Armando Carbonell is the Senior Fellow and Chairman of the Department of Planning and Urban Form at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I made the slip. He's a nationally recognized expert on land use planning for growing metropolitan regions and sustainable growth. His areas of expertise include city and regional planning, property rights and regulation, and land use and the environment. He also teaches planning at Harvard University and the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to his appointment at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, Mr. Carbonell is the founding executive director of the Cape Cod Commission, a regional planning and land use regulatory agency. He's both a contributor to and editor of the Lincoln Institute published Regional Planning in America, Practice and Prospect, a survey of the roots and applications of regional planning in America today and the prospects for its practice in the future. Mr. Carbonell received his degree from Clark University and was a doctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University and a Loeb Fellow here at Harvard. He's also the co-chair of America 2050, and I understand he'll tell us a little bit more about that. So, as I mentioned, I've asked each of the panelists to start us off with a few comments about the topic of land use planning and scale. So, Armando, if I could ask you to start.
All right. Do I get to say something like regions are rubbish, just to kind of get the juices flowing a little bit? No. But I think after that introduction, I probably can't get away with that. I have difficulty describing an ideal unit for regions because I think the scale of regions varies constantly with the functional issues that one needs to deal with. But let me introduce a principle that usually works for us, and it's one that has had a lot of use in the European Union, and that is a principle called subsidiarity. And this is an idea that one should make decisions at the lowest level at which it's possible to make those decisions. Now, I think there's a kind of a corollary to this, and I'll paraphrase Einstein, or paraphrase what is perhaps an invented quote that people like to say about Einstein, that explanation should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. And so I guess I'd say on this question that regions should be as local as possible, but not localer.
Thank you. Gerald.
So I'm not a planner. I teach at Harvard Law School, and I want to give you how I think about it. So I teach about the legal organizations of cities. how we set up cities, how we empower them, how we disempower them, what cities' relationships are among with each other within a region. The 101 cities in the Boston region, the 500 in Pittsburgh, the 900 in St. Louis. So, should we be neighborhood or should we be regional? I do not understand that question. I think every neighborhood issue of significance affects more than the neighborhood. And therefore, although the neighborhood has to be involved, more than the neighborhood has to be involved. Because if I develop a Walmart in my neighborhood, your stores are going to close down in your neighborhood. On the other hand, you can't think regionally without thinking about the particular neighborhoods that you're affecting. So to be regional is to focus ultimately on specific neighborhoods. So I don't see this. For me, the issue is not choose between neighborhood or region. The issue is, how do we link neighborhood and region? How do we put neighborhoods and regions together in some way in which we can begin to do this? And for me, this is a governance question. It's setting up governance institutions in which neighborhoods and regions can link to each other. Now, in order to do that, it requires a lot of creative thinking, and I'm not going to get into it here. Because what I want to say is that in the United States, we do not have neighborhood governments, and we do not have regional governments. Portland, to the contrary, notwithstanding. We have a lot of very creative thinking about regions, some people at this table and others in the room. But we do not have regional governments, and we do not have neighbor governments. We have city governments, and we have state governments. Those are our democratically elected, legitimate democratic organization in the United States today. When people use the word city, it's often very vague to me. Because when they say the word city, do you mean Boston, or do you mean all of the 101 cities in the region? What are you talking about? But we have 101 cities, and it's extremely important to recognize that, because they are the legally empowered entity that actually can make decisions about land use. And they are subject to the state government in a very significant way. The state government is the most important factor in urban decision-making in the United States by far. Now, when I go to urban planning events, no one ever mentions state governments ever. Well, I'm happy that you do. I'm happy to. Good. I'm about to have an ally here. I'm happy you do. But and city governments, I don't know. So I think we ought to talk about cities and how they're organized and their relationship to neighborhoods and to regions and how the state has failed to organize them.
Thank you. Amy.
Clearly, I'm eager to get into the conversation. I'm going to join the chorus of fellow panelists saying that it depends, or both. I think that our perception of neighborhood, local, regional, state is that we need to work at all of those levels simultaneously, and often with complex interactions among those levels of government and between entities at each level, to try to move our region forward to a vision that we hold. This is our regional plan, Metro Future. Well, this is the very much shortened summary of our regional plan. And it encapsulates a vision for this region, but not the specific changes that localities need to make in order to accomplish that vision. It's not up to us to tell Maynard what they should do with their land use in order to achieve this vision. It's up to them to take the context in which we present this regional vision, use it as information, and then move forward with their own decision making. So it's an example of how we seek to operate both at the regional level, where planning, I think, is very different than planning at the local or the neighborhood level, but each and every one of those levels is important. I think it is a governance question. For me, it's an influence question. How do I work locally through technical assistance projects, land use planning assistance to cities and towns or neighborhoods across the 101 municipalities of our region? How do I do that so each decision moves the region slowly toward the Metro Future vision? That's one way to do it, but we have to make those decisions within the context that's set in place by the state government, by the federal government, which provides a lot of constraints to the decision-making that those localities can make. So simultaneously, we're working at the state level to change policy, change the context in which those decisions at the local level are made. We know that regionally, we can accomplish a lot more in terms of economic competitiveness, in terms of social equity. There was another category that really resonated.
Not coming up.
Those two in particular, I think, are, and perhaps transportation planning is another arena where we really will fail as a region if we don't collaborate across our jurisdictional boundaries. So a lot of what we do is catalyze conversation and understanding among the individual municipalities, which in our region are such small units, they might well be a neighborhood in another part of the country. So, Boston is a part of our region. It's sort of, I never remember how many tons that gorilla is, but he's sort of a 2,000-ton gorilla. And yet they're an integral part of the region as a whole and dependent on that region. So helping the municipalities and the actors that go beyond municipal officials appreciate how our fortunes are all tied together is a big part of our work and part of what I see we all need to do if we are to move the metropolis forward.
Thank you. Robert.
Sure. Like Jerry Frug, I'm not a planner. Really don't know anything about it. I'm an urban sociologist, cityophile, so I love cities, and therefore delighted to be here and have conversations with people at GSD. And in fact, I've taught at Harvard, since 2003. I taught at the University of Chicago for about 12 years before that. And I never talked to a planner until about, 2 or 3 weeks ago when I went to a conference on urban ethics. And I come over here to get the stale coffee. My office is across the street. But so I think there's a new era afoot. I think it's terrific, and I hope to learn from you. So my answer is not terribly different. Let me just give you my perspective or a set of sort of higher order findings from my research. I'm an urban sociologist. I study the social organization of the city, and for the last 15 years or so I've been involved in a research project in Chicago that's attempting to sort that out through the concept of neighborhood effects. And let me just give you a sense of some of the conclusions I think that would bear on this particular conversation. One, which was probably not surprising given the title of my recent book, which revolves around the idea of the enduring neighborhood effect, and that is concentration effects. A surprising number of phenomena in today's society, despite our alleged placelessness, despite technology, and despite the massive social changes that have gone on, are concentrated in place. And I've studied things as diverse as crime, disorder, health, teenage pregnancy, technology use, altruism, immigration, you name it. It may not be the same neighborhood, but the extent to which they are shaped by neighborhood patterns is quite profound. Secondly, these phenomena suggest that it's a general kind of explanation. That is to say, it goes across diverse phenomena that seemingly have disparate causes. So things go together, and it suggests common mechanisms that we need to take into account. Thirdly, a surprising persistence across long periods of time. It's not just Chicago, although that's the site of my research. I've analyzed changes in poverty and immigration and crime and civic engagement, but yet there's a persistence both in the sense in which neighborhoods are relatively the same. That is, neighborhoods change, but their position in the overall hierarchy is quite stable. And the extent to which people react to neighborhood change is enduring over time. So this tells me that, number one, place matters, and that the local or the neighborhood is an important unit of planning. However, I would agree with Jerry, and in the third part of the book, I problematize the idea of neighborhood to say that it's not just what's going on within the indigenous qualities, but rather it's really that plus the relationships among neighborhoods and the social structure of the larger city. So, for example, spatial dynamics, what's going around in surrounding areas, but also cross-cutting ties throughout the region. And I can talk about this more later, but we studied, if you think about migration patterns, right? People move. And they move all over the city, regional area. Our study followed people from 1995, wherever they moved, not just in Chicago, but throughout the United States, and actually traced them out. And what I want to put forward is to ask you to think a bit in terms of cities as networks. And if you think about it, when someone moves, if you move from Cambridge to downtown Boston, in a sense you're establishing a tie. And we looked at spatial flows of people and how that changes the city or not, or reinforces existing inequalities. And I think that's a really important point, because then, in a sense, it elides the distinction between the local and the region and suggests maybe an alternative, or at least another way to think about the problem, which is one unit that I think planners should be concerned about is the relation, is the tie between these different kinds of phenomena. Another one is we looked at organizations, including law, politics, business, religion, education, and the ways in which leaders of these organizations work together or not, how they were tied into different kinds of organizations, and again, how those cross-cut our boundaries. And these are not just located in particular neighborhoods, although some neighborhoods are quite dense in their ties. But certain communities are connected by these networks. So that suggests, and I think it might have even been in one of the questions, that there's, in a way, a kind of a clustering that emerges based not on arbitrary boundaries that we might a priori assign, like here's the political boundary of the city, or here's what we define as the neighborhood, but rather clusters of meaningful activity patterns that are based on real activities, real ties, whether it's how people move, right? People vote with their feet, so that's telling you something. The extent to which organizations are linked matters to resource allocation, it matters to any number of things. So, neighborhood, region, yeah, they're both important, but so are the interconnections among them. I think it's a different way of saying what Jerry was saying, and I think there's some empirical evidence to bear that out. I would also just end by saying a few other things, which I'll pick up on later maybe, because I think my 3 to 5 minutes is up, but that is data. I think that we need new, innovative, creative forms of data in order to think about these issues. I've tried to do that with regard to neighborhood effects research, with regard to things like using videotaping, observations, community surveys. You know, people say, the community thinks this or the community's against that. Well, who's the community? Is it the person who speaks the loudest at the meeting? That's not the community. Civic engagement, various ways to use new technologies, applications. I can speak more about that. We're involved in a study here in Boston that's, I think, utilizing new technologies to get a handle on what citizens are actually doing with regard to their engagement with the city. And so this is the idea of, which I put forward in the book, ecometrics. It's basically the idea of a metric for ecology. And I argue that it's scalable, right? It's something that can be used to think about and measure relationships and behavior at the level of small units to large units. And I like fungible or fractal units. In fact, I argue that the neighborhood or place, I mean, let's think about it this way. Place is a fractal unit. It's a, place can be local, it can be your home, it can be your block, it can be your housing project, it can be Cambridge. And that analytic flexibility is important. So I think my overall pitch is to think theoretically, first of all, and then embed in that our latest research and data on how these patterns work out, rather than just sort of trying to answer a priori whether it's the region or the neighborhood.
Thank you. And I think all of you gave us some really good thoughts that I'd like to follow up on. And one, before I turn to the questions that Hupo's prepared, is this issue of influence, that several of you referred to the significance of having the group of you representing different interests at the table. That's not the traditional group that you see at the GSD. And who's not at the table? Where are the points of influence in the community, whether small scale? And I use community deliberately, recognizing that there are, I think, a lot of people out there that don't associate themselves with being part of a city. And I think we need to be cognizant of not appearing exclusive when we talk about planning in that way. So I know, Amy, you brought up the issue of influence. I'm curious to hear a little bit more from you about that.
I have an agenda. And so when I mentioned the word influence, I was actually thinking about developing allies who can stand with me in a local town meeting or planning board or at the State House, and help me make the case for the kind of change we need to complete my agenda, this plan. But I think, you raise another way of thinking about influence and questioning who's at the table, where are the key points of influence. I think in the last 10, 15 years or so, my organization has shifted a lot to appreciate both the relevance of policy change on our work and the relevance of community organizing on our work, and the importance of ensuring that we actually reach as many different constituencies in a particular place as we can when we are providing that technical assistance or developing that bylaw or establishing that plan. I think that we have to acknowledge not only is this panel, pretty well educated, and myself probably least among them, but we're all white and we are not representative of the community around us. So what influence do we have? What influence do people who aren't in this room have? When we bring community organizing into our work, you really highlight that local, often hyper-local to regional dichotomy. Typically, the key influencer is not an elected official. My favorite example is the woman who makes the coffee at the church, so that when the services are over, the congregation files down. She's the one who actually tells people in the congregation what the issues they should be concerned about are. She's actually the opinion leader in that community. So if I want to understand the concerns and needs of a community, I need to talk to her, not to the elected officials that are representing the community. And so I feel there are a couple of different ways we could talk about influence, and I may have taken us in a direction you didn't anticipate, but I'm going to leave you with that.
Armando, you've...
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I can recall when we were putting the Cape Cod Commission together, which turned out to be a kind of authoritative, strong form, regulatory planning body that actually did, have the ability to make decisions. An important fellow in my training, Hank Foster, who taught here for many years and was a kind of father of bioregionalism, took me aside and said, Armando, I think you're making a big mistake. You've had a lot of influence, and now you're going to have authority, and that you're going to really lose something as a result. And, I think, I'm not sure I totally agreed with him then or now, but it is interesting how these things exchange. I brought along some props that will amount to door prizes because I'm traveling and I don't want to take them with me. So folks who show some enthusiasm will get to take some things home. But the Lincoln Institute did a book a little while ago called Working Across Boundaries, and I think it really gets at the issue of influence in a way. And that's to say that in order to do things regionally, very often one has to work across jurisdictional boundaries because they rarely match the actual geography of the problems that one is dealing with. And one of our colleagues, Kate Foster, actually argues that things aren't regional unless they're multi-jurisdictional, that's sort of the essence of regionalism, is that it's cutting across boundaries. But this book takes mutual gains negotiation theory and applies it to explaining and helping to show how to work across boundaries, essentially by providing benefits to those who voluntarily come together to do things across boundaries. And the planner can play a role as a kind of community organizer in organizing regional communities, which needs to be defined and is kind of a vague idea, but that can go from convening these communities and helping them find benefits that are mutual and working together, facilitating the planning process, and beyond that, and in some discussions I've been involved in the last few days with some very ambitious regional planners, actually brokering the deals, really going in and bringing people together and helping to make decisions across boundaries about big infrastructure projects and big public investments. So, I think influence is important, but I think there may be other functions that planners play that are short of, being decision makers themselves, and I'd say in almost all cases that's going to be true, but they essentially revolved around why would people get together to do things across jurisdictional boundaries? What are the benefits to them of engaging in that behavior?
That's a great point. I'd like to come back to
Can
that.
I stir a
Gerald.
little controversy? So I think a lot of people talk about the region as having people having connection across the region, and I completely agree with Rob. That's true. It is absolutely true. People move from town to town. They work in one city. They live in another city. They shop in a third city. They visit friends in a fourth city. They disregard these lines. That is a regional experience. But the political lines matter. They really matter. We can't pretend, oh, well, whatever, we'll all talk across lines. No. Look, you cross a line, your life changes. You're in a different school district. In fact, you cross the line to be in a different school district. Your taxes change. You're in the zoning jurisdiction of another jurisdiction. The local rules change. We shouldn't think of these city boundaries as something we can not pay attention to. The decision makers at the local level, empowered by the state, are incredibly important. Now, the last thing I want to say is the reason they have the power is that the state gives it to them. It's not that the organization of the regions is not, it's up to the cities to decide. It's up to the state to design city power. The current city power is designed by the state. It could be redesigned by the state. It could be redesigned by the state tonight. There is no impediment to creating a more regional relationship among the cities in the Boston area or anywhere else in the country, other than changing state law. The legal system and the jurisdictional system and the governmental system is way out of whack with life, way out of whack. And it really matters in terms of decision-making power, who can actually approve a project.
Armando, did you?
Just to rise to that a little bit, I totally agree about the importance of these territories, and in fact, I'd say a real obstacle to regionalism and the kind of regional behavior I'm talking about is the it's almost inherent problem that regionalists are working against the interests of established political power. And these spaces are defended. And as you say, they are legitimate as well. So, I mean, we don't contest that. But I think, my 40 years as a card-carrying regionalist have mostly been marked by the inability to change those boundaries. We've had some success, but I have to say it's been extremely rare in the United States. And as a result, I think I've come around to the notion that we do have to acknowledge the legitimate political jurisdictions, but we have to figure out how to get them to work together in different ways. And it's challenging, but I think if the benefits are strong enough, you can overcome this sort of natural parochial behavior.
Robert?
Yeah. So I actually agree with Jerry, although I would say that those political boundaries, I think we need to study, why and how they're reinforced. Right. So, in other words, when I was talking earlier about the nature of people moving and the ties, the key there is that they're highly non-random, right? So that the migration flows, when they cross these boundaries, work in ways that reinforce these hierarchies in a very consistent and durable way. So if you look at, for example, population flow, in the case that I've studied, Chicago metropolitan area, it's very consistent from the south side to certain south suburbs. They're crossing city boundaries, imposing new demands on other kinds of jurisdictions, which then set in motions which lead people in those jurisdictions to leave. I don't think we can understand or even formulate a regional way of thinking without a better understanding of those, because there is no such thing in my mind. I mean, you can impose it analytically, but that the region as a social concept, I don't think makes a lot of sense for these very reasons. Similarly, the ties among organizations and leaders in real estate and political actors, they're often very aware of these. And their actions and ties and network structures are also involved in this reproduction. So therefore, that's why I was saying that taking those into account, thinking about these clusters and these activity, information-based, migration-based flows is, I think, an important way to understand the social organization of the metropolis in a way that could at least better inform planning. I mean, how that, I have no policy advice in terms of implementing a regional approach to, let's say, housing or something like that. On the other hand, if you're unaware of those, I think it's doomed to failure.
I think, as Rob is saying, a creative and innovative approach to data is essential. I think it's absolutely essential. But I think a creative and innovative approach to governance is also essential. I think as long as regionalism is understood as the enemy of city power, it will go nowhere in the United States. That regionalism needs to empower cities and not to disempower them. And it needs to empower them in this way. If you work together, you get more power. If you work against each other, you get less power. And who's talking this way? It's the state government. The state government can empower cities to work together, or they can empower them to compete with each other. They are now largely empowering them to compete with each other and to work against each other. And this is a design. So I think we need to reformulate the idea of regionalism not as smash the local, but empower a collective local.
Can I ask a question of Jerry? Mm-hmm. Am I discerning a little bit of an argument that the state is deliberately pitting municipalities against each other? That it's somehow in the state's interest to keep the municipality?
Well, I don't know. I don't think it's conspiracy, and I don't think it's no. I think if you organize local finance mostly through property tax, then you're going to be competing for the supermarket and for the mall because you want the tax. You don't have to organize local finance that way, and if you didn't organize local finance that way, the competition would be different. So there are a lot of suburbs in the United States today who don't want kids. And the reason they don't want kids is kids cost money because kids go to school. It's too bad, but they do. But they want old people. And the reason they want old people is that old people are not supported by the locality. So switch the rule. We now support old people locally and kids nationally. And then they'd want the opposite. These rules, I don't think it's designed to create a particular form, but I think it has that impact.
Yeah.
And we need to study it, carefully analyze it, and we need to reform it.
And how do we begin to do that?
Well, just one point, though, with what you're saying, it's obvious that you have to solve the education problem in the United States, really, before you can get a handle on any of this, because
And the education problem is exacerbated by the way we've organized it.
Yeah, exactly, and that's part of the reason that reinforces the neighborhood
Yes, totally.
differences.
If I could turn, in light of this issue and the discussion about a need for some pretty substantial reform, I'd like to talk about the role of engaging the community in that conversation, because clearly, in order to have reform of that magnitude, we need to have some more folks at the table, a better understanding of how all of these issues interrelate. And how do we do that? Where are there examples we can turn to, small examples perhaps where that's happened? Gerald, clearly you've thought quite a bit about this. You've got a very strong opinion about it. But I think one of the great values we have of the people in this room are a group of problem solvers, but we're also talking about some pretty broad issues. So where do we begin taking this energy and some of the common ground that's emerging among the four of you?
I'll give you a few suggestions as to what might motivate that, and one is simply running out of money. And I think there are plenty of areas where that's happening these days. And regional efficiency, which comes from sometimes combining smaller units into bigger ones to save on costs, happens. And, it happens with regional school districts, it happens with regional service districts in a number of areas. And it doesn't happen because people like the idea of regionalizing. And I can remember a town meeting on Cape Cod a number of years ago where there was a discussion in the town of Harwich about a regional school district with the town of Chatham. Now, town of Chatham is a pretty precious little place. But the individual from Harwich said that he didn't fight in World War II to have his children educated on foreign shores in the next town of Chatham. And so there are strong feelings about these things, but they can be overcome. And I think, for the most part, regional things happen out of necessity, not out of a love of regions or a desire to do things regionally. And they often happen late. And there are often missed opportunities because of I agree with Jerry that there are huge resistance factors that make this very difficult to do. But if we think of regionalism as a kind of super localism that gives something back, then it's plausible.
I can illustrate your point with a couple of examples. About 10 years ago, a woman in my office almost got accosted in a restaurant because she worked for an organization that was suggesting that fire departments might regionalize across two towns. And in the more recent economic times, my organization has actually done a pretty good business of helping municipalities regionalize discrete services. So it's animal control services, it's health departments. We recently had a big coup. We have a couple of municipalities interested in maybe merging their police departments, each of which has an independent union. So this is very incremental work, but tied to a broader notion of what we're trying to accomplish, I think you can see how it all moves the pieces forward. And you never know. The success that you achieve in regionalizing that animal control function might give those municipalities comfort with another level of regionalization. So you start there, but then you work with them to ratchet it up. We have a couple of purchasing consortia. Literally, they start introducing municipal officials to each other by buying things like toner cartridges together in a purchasing collaborative. It's not about saving money, although that's an advantage that you achieve by having greater purchasing power. It's about the conversations you have over the donuts when you get together to choose the toner. It's about the appreciation you gain for the commonalities and what you can accomplish together that you can't accomplish apart. So starting at a level where there's comfort, building greater comfort to move forward is a slow process, but we did see a great deal more interest in regionalizing in this recent time.
Mm-hmm. And Robert?
Yeah, I want to hear Jerry's strong opinion. I'm not sure what it is, but
She said I had one.
Yeah, she said you had one. A cautionary note. I mean, this whole notion of what is the community is been thought about in the literature and studied a lot. It's actually quite a complicated question, and it's not clear. who is the community? I mean, just to use a local example, maybe to stir up the pot a little bit. I mean, think of the conversations that ensued over development in Alston when Harvard thought it had money. And there were lots of, protests and claims made by certain groups about, the community, right? We want this. We want X, and you're not listening to the community. And I tried to raise the question to some, well, I will not name names, people at Harvard that, well, I mean, have you actually looked into this? Is that the community? Who is the community? Oftentimes, of course, it is a sort of representative. Other times people take it upon themselves, have vested interests within particular groups. There's contestation among community organizations, different groups. And the other thing is, I have a feeling here we're thinking, even in this regional sense, about local and community in static terms. It's in identity even. Actually, in many cases, people don't give a damn about the community, and part of the reason is they're on a trajectory where they do not intend to stay. It's a deliberate choice to be in a place for a reason, for a short period of time, and they then want to move on. Others intend to stay. Right there you have a conflict. You have a conflict between homeowners and renters often. This is a huge conflict that plays out in the urban literature. If you look at civic engagement, if you look at any number of things, that's one of the big predictors. Age is a big difference. So for me as a sociologist, I want to know, well, you need to know about those kinds of cleavages in dimensions of social stratification and identity and intention to live in the community. In the old urban sociological literature, this used to be called attachment to place. Comes out of the systemic literature in the 60s and 70s, John Cassard and others. But it's useful literature to consider because it gets at issues of under what conditions does an identity emerge in a community where there's a strong feeling? Like, I mean, Chatham, clearly. I know someone who lives in Chatham, and indeed he goes there every summer in hell or high water. And that's real, but there's heterogeneity, tremendous heterogeneity across communities in this, so you can't assume any kind of constancy. And therefore, you need a theory of how these things vary, at least from my perspective, not so much a planning perspective, but I think it would inform planning, in terms of the structural features that influence identity, civic engagement. Civic engagement varies a lot. Some communities, it's just a small handful of people. Others, it's very intense. And, we actually know a lot about that and what predicts it. So I say bring that information to bear on it.
Armando, I know you want to respond, and then, Gerald, I'd like to talk to you about this question of governance and authority.
So this is just a note on a sort of technical aspect of this that might be of interest to planners here, and it's hot off. Still smells like a printing press. Just came in today. A new report we have at Lincoln on opening access to scenario planning tools, and a lot of this is really about how one helps people understand this sort of nebulous thing, the future of regions, in much more concrete terms, using tools like simulation tools in 3 dimensions. And the particular focus in this is how to actually advance the development of these tools through more open source type ecosystems. But available on our website for free download, or somebody gets a still hot off the presses copy if they want.
Thank you.
Can I comment on this? So there's some caricature history of urban planning in which there was a long period in which experts thought they could write a plan, it would be a good idea, and implement it, which turned out not to actually survive. And then there's an idea, well, we need to involve regular people in this. I'm looking at Gerald Caden, my friend here over there, because he actually knows what this real story is here, and I don't. And there was a turn, and I want to know when this was, Gerald. There's a return to the idea of community, that we're going to talk to the community, and that is the way we're going to. And the question is, where did that idea come from? Because the political system organizes democratic decision-making at the city and state level. And what the problems that Rob is talking about in terms of who the community are real, because what are you talking about, the whole neighborhood or the block, or who's representing Betty, and who are we talking to, and are they asking for too much or too little, or what kind of deals are we making? All these problems come from this idea of community. But nevertheless, we're very wed because we're populist small d Democrats and populist large d Democrats for this idea. But it's a theory of politics which I wish were true, something like that. But it leaves out the power of powerful moneyed interests in politics. Just never gets mentioned, and I'd like to mention it. So the instinct, if you run out of money, may not be to work with your neighboring jurisdictions, but to privatize. Mm-hmm. And the instinct, if you run out of money, might not be to try to reform our school system so we actually educate all of the children of the state, but casinos. So I think we need a more sophisticated notion of politics in trying to think about what's going on in terms of decision making than that if we listen to the voice of the community, we're all right.
Amy, any thoughts?
I'm not really sure exactly. I agree with some of what you just said. I mean, I think that, first of all, I don't typically think of community as being municipality. I think a lot of people have affinity groups and derive a sense of community that isn't about the political jurisdiction municipality. Maybe that just sort of resonates for me because I've actually gone through a bit of an effort to stop referring to municipalities as communities in order to be a little clearer, but I get the feeling we're talking a little bit synonymously about those. And I think that our system of government has its strengths and its weaknesses. And I think that our elected officials get into office for a variety of reasons and in a variety of ways. And then they represent the interests that they were elected to represent in some ways. And that's not going to be all of the communities, all of the constituencies, all of the interests that are present in a town. The majority wins, that leaves out the minority. So how do the minority, who may be concentrated in a certain part of town, have their interests brought to bear? What if it's a ethnic community that by culture or other reasons doesn't turn out to vote? So how are their interests represented? I think a lot of these things are on my mind when I go to talk to the community, but I also don't have any notion that I know what's right for a given municipality, for a given geographic or otherwise defined community. I'm a facilitator. My office will tell you I'm a process-oriented person. And I really believe that process is important. We use a lot of scenario planning tools to engage people in discovering trade-offs that they then confront with each other to make decisions about their future. That can't happen in a democratic vote majority rules sort of structure.
So how do we resolve this issue of authority? I'm just looking at some of the questions that were proposed, and there is a theme within them of how do we organize whether it's within municipal boundaries or absent municipal boundaries, how do we organize ourselves to begin planning, and then how do we organize the authority through which we implement and govern?
Well, here's a further problem, okay? The boundaries of the systems that you need to deal with are pretty much all different. And so if you're looking to create authorities that are perfect with respect to the geography of the decisions that are being made, you're going to need a lot of special purpose districts. And of course, this has been a tendency in government to actually create authorities and other entities that are able to think about things at a watershed scale or at some other sort of physically defined set of dimensions that make sense. But I think it's only rare that these things actually coincide enough that you can have, highly efficient regional governments that actually cover everything. Now, you can make them better or worse, and, generally speaking, bigger would cover better, but would then have the problem of being more remote from people and sort of violate the subsidiarity rule that I suggested. So I think this is a built-in problem. I don't think this at all easy. And for me, what it suggests is a need to be pretty flexible in thinking about the boundaries of regions and then working to align the decision process in some way so that it mostly correctly addresses the scale of the things it's trying to do.
Robert.
Well, I don't know how you organize it, but I kind of wanted to react to Jerry and also some of the recent comments. The question of, where did it come from, this idea of, why be concerned about the community and the issues of governments. I think you have to separate the formal governance structures and the informal governance structures. And again, the problem is that people aren't identifying with the governance structures, at the level at which the rules are implemented and have authority. And it's not just on the positive end, right, in the sense of identity people may have with places like the Chatham person, but also the cleavages that exist in society. I mean, the concentration of disadvantage, racial segregation, or at the other end, concentration of affluence, these are persistent phenomenon, and people are not and do not identify with neighborhoods. And it's not even about space. By the way, there's an interesting study that was done that actually measured distance between neighbors and took into account the actual networks of streets that existed in the entire city. Actually, it was L.A., San Francisco, Boston, and Chicago, I think it was. And the idea was to connect up and think of the network of reachability. That is to say, can I reach you without crossing any major thoroughfare? So the idea was to really try to bound it, not by some arbitrary unit, but actual by real physical structures. Interesting, I think, from a planning perspective, right? And what he found was that racial segregation was profoundly shaped by these, what he called tertiary communities, which are communities that are reachable without crossing major boundaries, not by spatial distance. So, in other words, you could be, close to a neighborhood of a different racial ethnic group, but if there was a highway, freeway, whatever, going through it, it didn't matter, and it could go some distance in the other way. Just another example of the power of these differentiating forces in social life. So, Jerry, so when you say, well, that's not the unit of governance, well, that's true, but on the other hand, that's how people are acting and reacting. In this case, it's often not even just schools, because it has to do oftentimes with children, in the sense of the interaction, who children are going to play with, and so forth. So I'm not sure how you solve the problem, but the way people, conceptually are thinking, I think it's not just the idea, but the data are consistent with the notion that place matters in how people think about life. They think locally, but and yet our decisions politically right now are organized at these other levels of structures. And even if you bend those structures, I think that people react against structures. People have agency, and again, that was the whole problem with. I mean, if you go back to the busing controversy here in Boston, right? That was a classic problem of institutional design, and Garrity was terribly restricted because he couldn't deal with it on a metropolitan region, right? And so you could have the thought experiment say, well, if he had, then that would have solved the problem, but not necessarily, because then people may have moved out of whatever boundaries were the regional. And so that's why I think it's really important that we, even though it's terribly complex, that the phenomenon demands that we think about it relationally and both. It's not the community or this larger governance structure, even though it is surely a structural constraint.
So I'd like to agree with you and put it stronger. because I tend to put things strong. So, I think people have lost faith in the governance structure. I agree with that. Here's the stronger version. I think people in the United States have lost faith in democracy.
Yeah.
I think we no longer believe in it. This great democratic country doesn't believe in democratic institutions. So we look elsewhere. We look at all these public authorities and build public authorities with appointed bodies to run government services. We privatize. We talk about people getting together and solving their own problems as if there is no government. We do everything. So meanwhile, the government gets worse and worse when we don't pay attention to it. And it gets more and more dysfunctional as it gets more fragmented, nevertheless remains powerful, right? So I think that the road of losing faith in democracy in a democratic country is a bad road to be on. Rather not, in other words, not say, well, let's forget those things. That's not my position. I think we need to reform the governance structure and the democracy as it's now working. I mean, now we could talk about 100 things like campaign finance. Want to talk about it? No, I don't. But you could. I mean, in other words, we have a lot of issues in our democratic system that's making it dysfunctional. But I don't think we should throw up our hands about it. Which I think I'm not saying you do. I'm not saying you do. I think people generally have.
Yeah.
And I could see you. I might be about to suggest that we throw up our hands, but I actually think I'm going to suggest that we walk and chew gum at the same time, because I think that reforming our government will take a lot of time and is important. And just as we try to help localities make the best decisions as possible within the structure provided by state policy, I think we need to make the best, do regional governance, which I will differentiate from regional government. I think we are doing regional governance in Metro Boston with a very flexible set of regions that are applicable, and we collaborate a lot. We have regional decision-making of a kind, and that's working okay. And I don't know that we're going to ever come up with a perfect alternative. And I think we do need to modify our governmental structures. In the meantime, let's embrace regionalism as appropriate sometimes.
Where did the decline come from, though, Jerry?
What's that?
Where did it come from? Don't we have to identify that, right?
What come from?
This decline in belief in democracy. I mean, who can argue that dysfunctionality isn't a key feature of government? But right, the history of America. I mean, it's built into the DNA. These very issues we were talking about: community, identity with local place, yet democracy. Right. So that's old. Is the hills the notion of you help your neighbor, local kinds of place-based notions. So something has happened structurally at the level. I mean, there's different narratives about this, right? I mean, one is bullying alone kind of narrative. There's the coming apart narrative. I'm not saying I agree with any of these. I'm just saying that, and you're giving us a kind of a version of that, right? Which is democracy is declining. Here we're supposed to talk about urban planning practicality, right? Sorry, folks, but I do think that getting some handle on the structural forces behind that would be important.
And let me suggest that I think this is worthy of a whole debate, discussion in and of itself. So, one comment is sort of thinking about the resources here at Harvard and the Kennedy School of Government in terms of bringing into the conversation. But we do want to open this up to the audience for your questions. So one of you, I see some microphones there. So if I could just ask you to have the microphone before you ask your question.
Could folks introduce themselves?
And if you can introduce yourself as well.
Thank you. My name's Ann Tate, and I'm teaching in the urban planning program here, but I've also done a lot of this community level planning and also worked at the state level, and I find this discussion extremely interesting, and I am tempted to see that we've gotten very good at the community scale of planning and the tools and bringing people into this process, but I completely agree with Mr. Ferg that there's a disconnect here between where the levers of operational governmental power are, and that there's some form in which we're we're working with this citizenry, but it isn't reflected. And I would be very interested in your comments about, since we are planners and people who are interested in these sort of more structural solutions, is what could happen at the state level to make these things more operational. The issues that Armando identified, that there are all these jurisdictional boundaries that don't overlap, make it very difficult for the citizenry to participate in these decisions, because they don't, they're all separated, and they may not, it's not like you just get involved in government and you can figure out where to go and where to do these things. And I know that in Massachusetts in particular, the enabling legislation for local zoning decisions is extremely problematic. And so even when you have a municipality that is interested in doing something that moves forward. So I would just be interested in your comments about how we work to reconcile, what are the structural impediments to having a more participatory process up and down the levels.
I have only 1 minute to answer this question. So I think we need to, first thing, which is I think a study question, I'm for all of Rob's study question, and I want to add this one too. We need to figure out how many people in the metropolitan Boston are disserved by the current form. How many people are worse off because of this fragmentation in terms of the kinds of schools they go to and the kind of neighborhoods they go to, in terms of their closeness to jobs and the way the development is happening. And I think we need an education business in which people will understand the way the current governance system is disserving them. And then what I want is I want to create a actual regional institution. The state can do this in order to bring the cities together to begin to talk to each other. In other words, we don't have to really have a conversation at a fundamental level about how to organize our housing system and how to organize our education system and all the other systems, and that's what I want to do. But it needs a political effort. It needs a political effort. And the thing is, the business community in the history of regionalism in the United States has been consistently pro-regional, because they think of the region as an economy. So, I mean, I wouldn't try to write them off as not an ally. In other words, the ordinary people are a part of it, but unless the coalition has to be broad. It's a very complicated issue, needless to say.
Other responses?
Just that the business community, business civic organizations have led regional planning processes in many places around the country, and it's been difficult to engage the business civic structures here, which I think is something we need to address.
In the Boston area specifically.
That's right.
I would just say that, I think the educational piece is important. I mean, if people had more, information, because in one sense, a lot of these structures that we talk about, we have to be careful as if they're, permanent. I mean, they can be overthrown, so to speak, in a day. I mean, think about revolutions around the world. I mean, our collective action actually has an effect. And I guess the question in part is, why isn't there more sort of civic action? Because these things are not inherent. They're socially constructed and can be deconstructed. And when you see it happening around the world, it does really raise the question of, it does seem like in the U.S. it's a bit of an unusual situation. So the positive way to view this, rather than saying, wow, there's nothing that can be done, is that is to recognize that these sorts of civic and collective roots are actually very powerful.
Which gives me an interesting idea. There's something like a regional planners spring, and something beyond.
I'd have a sexier title.
Which probably would scare a lot of people, but most of the big successful regional planning efforts in this country have been business and civic led for the most part, and more business probably than civic. But there are other interests that might actually come to the fore, and I think that's a very interesting idea.
Thank you. Other questions? In the back?
It's a rule. You've got to use the mic.
Thank you. My name is Rachel Gordon. I'm a master's student at the Fletcher School in the Department of Urban and Environmental Planning at Tufts. Thank you for this excellent discussion. My question is, have we really lost faith in democracy, or have we enfranchised more and more people over the last century who didn't have any good reason to have faith in democracy in the first place, given that it was really built on their backs without asking their opinion? And I think that that's more than just a framing question. I mean, it sort of frames it a different way, but I do think it's more than that, because you come up with really different answers about how to engage with communities, municipalities, populations, whatever, depending on the answer. And then what do you do with that?
Good question. I think that's correct in a fundamental level. In fact, there's a lot of debate now that in terms of how society has changed, heterogeneity, diversity, and so forth, and how that affects perceptions of the collective good. And this is also true at the national level, right, in terms of contributions to the net of the collective, and in the extent to which welfare states, for example, in Europe, are perhaps changing based on increasing diversification of the population. Again, as an observation. And I think that one could argue, I suppose, that some groups, the sort of the hunkering down, that's kind of the Putnam argument, is in part driven by that, which leads to this separation and perhaps, if we go Jerry's route, democracy decline. On the other hand, the optimist in me, and I think with increasing immigration, we're seeing a blurring of boundaries that through time, I actually think a lot of those barriers will dissipate, not overnight, but will decline. So it may be that we're in a transition phase societally. I mean, it's controversial and conflictual, but that the long-term trajectory might actually be positive. And if you think about, I would just put this out there, I don't know if this is controversial or not, but if you think about immigration, there's lots of debate about it, but actually in the United States, I think we do it better than other countries. And in fact, many of the more homogeneous, historically, European countries, which are now diversifying, are seeing more conflict than we are. So I actually think there's sort of counterexamples that suggest that we're in a phase transition, but perhaps on the right direction, even though we don't know it. And some people are on the losing side of history, and if people, again, it goes to the education part. The more people understand that we have commonalities, and therefore, through collective action, can change the entrenched structures that actually dominate everyone, so everyone's losing, there can be change. And so, again, it goes to the notion of, well, don't organize around the region because no one cares about that. But if people knew about things like their taxes or how their sort of everyday life, health, access to insurance, education for kids is harmed, I think people would agree with this, by these existing structures, then they would, quote, overthrow them to the extent that they felt that they had the power to do so. So getting to that point, I think, is good.
Rob and I were at a conference recently together in which many people used the reference to Tahrir Square. And the question for me is that this Arab Spring, their goal was to create a democratic government, a government that would represent them. And if they fail, they will have failed. I don't know why it is that the people who are enfranchised you talk about don't have such a goal in the same way. These people were also completely excluded from political power in their whole lifetime, right? So, but they see that as a goal. So Rob calls for many studies. I'm calling for him to make this study, or other people. I mean,
I'm calling for action here.
We need to understand this process. As you said earlier, we need to understand how this process is happening in the United States.
Armando?
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on what I see as a responsibility that planners have given the conditions that you describe and the increasing inequality in this country, which manifests itself often in a kind of spatial segregation, to confront that and, within their powers to deal with it, through the political system, but also through their planning practice. And I think part of this is simply revealing it. There's a data component to it. But I think taking some responsibility for the disaffected communities, which may be disaffected for very good reasons, and to the extent one can, drawing them in an effective way to a process that might improve their lives. But I think I'm sort of torn between the call for revolution here and the likelihood that we're going to be dealing with something like this condition for a very long time and need to work within it somehow.
Other questions? Yes, down here.
Rules. I'm Julia Ledowitz. I'm a Tufts graduate student in the Urban Environmental Planning and Policy group. And I'm not to take the people equation out of this, but rather to highlight one way that people will be affected in a way that government must act. We're going to be facing natural resource constraint at a level that does not match up with political bounds or even community bounds, but will dramatically affect communities in diverse ways and along inequitable ways as well. And I'm wondering, how do we confront these issues with an authoritative structure that won't allow for decisions to be made at that kind of level right now? We're not making regional decisions. In fact, we tried to make RGGI happen at a regional level to look at greenhouse gases, and it has basically been devolved over time because we don't have a structure in place to work at that kind of level. So what will we do with our natural resource constraint?
I'm glad you asked. And I think it's one of the strongest arguments for regional, taking regional approaches seriously. And we do happen to have, hot off the presses this week, a book, Resilient Coastal City Regions, Planning for Climate Change in the United States and Australia. And it looks at 9 different metropolitan areas and broader urban areas in the 2 countries from the point of view of the necessity of taking a regional approach and where the effects are being felt at regional scale and the response has to be regional. And this goes back to my argument that we won't do this because we like doing it. We'll do it because we have to, and I think we're going to deal with climate change, not because we love the idea or that it has any convenient sort of results, but because we'll have no choice.
Amy, would
the
you like
discourse has shifted from climate change mitigation to climate change adaptation. Yet I don't see us getting serious and finding the political will to act. I'm not even sure which region is the appropriate region. We're not going to do that until there's a crisis. And, God willing,
It'll be very interesting to see what
crisis.
comes out of California, where they have gone a step ahead in terms of a regional structure to try to deal with mitigation and adaptation. And I actually don't think they have strong enough regions to do it, but I think we'll learn something about that through their efforts to do it.
Robert?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know what the answer is. Other than to say that that needs to be incorporated. It makes me think of, you mentioned climate change. I was thinking of water, too, right? And it's not just a U.S. issue. This is a global issue. Just as a note, next year is there's going to be a series of events at Radcliffe Institute. It's going to be the Year of Water, interdisciplinary approaches to thinking about water as a development issue. But it's also important for urban planning, obviously. Southwest, that's well known, but it's going to increasingly be an issue. And there's some really creative ways, I think, to bring science and environmental studies into the study of community and urban planning. So I'm glad you raised that. And then one just final thing I'd like to say on a practical note, because I really wasn't calling for revolution, but maybe it's not a bad idea. And that is, in planning, I'm curious, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that, at least in effect, a lot of the planning efforts when it comes to housing end up seemingly reinforcing a lot of the structures of separation that we see. And I'm sort of curious as to why there isn't more planning or development of mixed income housing and communities of the sort that over time would allied some of these differences. And I think actually my belief based on the data goes back to the question asked up top, is that there's actually sort of a latent demand for that kind of life. I mean, in the sense of, I think, diversity, cities, there's a return to cities. I'm not a Jane Jacobs Pollyannish scholar here, but nonetheless, there is strong evidence that under appropriate conditions, that there's a real demand side, in that planners and governments have just assumed that a certain kind of uniformity of housing, and in the form of single track homes and homogeneous suburbs with land use separated, and that's breaking down. And so
we have enough of that.
Planners can be at the foreground of really radically changing it.
Other questions?
My name is Mark Older, and I was one of Boston's first district planners, which was 1972, to answer your question, followed in 1973 by little city halls, and in about 1975 by the politicization of the district planning program, because we were working too strongly with the communities. But I wanted also to point out that the regionalization of Boston, which was pretty strong early on, and going back quite a ways, was not revolutionary but counter-revolutionary, because it came about trying to keep Irish control of the city from having anything to control. And the power brokers and the power forces said, let's move decision-making as much as we can out of the city, including, until recently, the chief of police for the city of Boston was named at the state level. The MDC, the park system, all these wonderful regional attributes that we have, except for yours, were largely created out of fear rather than out of economics. One more thing, I also became the first citywide planner after being a district planner. And that felt like being a regional planner, because at that time, which was like 1976, you could walk, especially in Charlestown and Southie, but in other areas, you could stop anybody on the street and say, how do I get to Boston? And nobody would say, what are you talking about, you idiot? You're in Boston. No, they would say, take the bridge and follow that line, and so, or take the orange line.
Thank you for your comments. It's my understanding that we need to begin wrapping up. So I would like to ask each of our panelists to share some closing thoughts with us. We've certainly, not surprisingly, raised a lot of questions, but I think there is quite a bit of common ground, or we've certainly heard that there's no one singular answer to the question of how do we plan, at what scale, that it really does depend on the context and the circumstances, and that it needs to be interactive between multiple scales. This notion of how do we create linkages between different systems, between people, planning systems, ecological systems, economies. The question of governance is a big one. Really, I think challenging our assumptions about the way we have organized ourselves. We are currently organized as a society, the authority by which we mandate or create regulations that govern land use, but that it's not necessarily restricting us from taking on more ambitious planning that crosses municipal boundaries. But it is a key issue, and I think there need to be some other people who become a part of that conversation. Education was a big theme that came through, not only thinking about how we organize ourselves in communities or municipalities in regard to education to ensure equity, but also how do we educate people about the importance of this issue and begin, whether it's a revolution, a dialogue, how do we begin if we believe that there is a need for thinking structurally about change, how do we begin to catalyze that? And what are our responsibilities as planners? Who else needs to be at the table? How do we begin to do this? The issue of data, we did not dive into as much as I had hoped, but clearly that is a way of creating information that becomes a point of argument or education, to the point of what are communities, municipalities not getting as a result of some of these issues that we've talked about, as well as what's the potential. And certainly the issue of the environment, of thinking we have some larger issues that require us to think more broadly. So, wondered, Armando, would you like to start with some thoughts?
Well, I'm going to go home thinking very seriously about Jerry's comments about people generally losing faith in democracy and how we can reform government. I think we have to take that very seriously. But I sense that there are going to be multiple sectors at work in the world that planners have to deal with, and that the civic sector, the private sector, the government sector are going to have to learn to work together in different ways. So it's not just about how we organize ourselves in space, but there are also going to be different institutional arrangements. And I think particularly as we look at the ways in which we have to figure out how to pay for things that we've not been paying for a long time, we're going to be forced to get pretty creative. And I think it may change some of these underlying relationships.
Thank you. Gerald.
So I'd just like to say a word about your environmental question. Gerald and I, tomorrow next, teach a course this semester on urban sea rise in the Boston Harbor, together with climate scientists and others. And if you obviously the Boston Harbor covers more than Boston, but if you think about who could do anything about it, the first thing you'd need to focus on, from my point of view, is the list of federal statutes that govern what anybody can do in the Boston Harbor, and the list of state statutes that govern what anybody could do in the Boston Harbor, as impediment, as a maze of complications that need to be addressed in order to actually do something.
You, Amy.
I think I'm thinking a lot about all of that conversation, but generally about the relationship between planning and politics. Is there a way to be a planner without dealing with politics? I'm not sure. I think that you're fooling yourself if you think that you can, frankly. And also thinking about the relationship between planning and social change. Whether we're exclusively focused on the people who live and work in a region, or more broadly on the environment and the structures within which they reside. I think the plans we put in place, the work we do, does move our society forward in a way that we should be conscious of. And I at times think maybe my title, instead of Director of Regional Plan Implementation, which is sort of long and unwieldy and really hard for the average person to connect with, should be, I don't know, something like social agent or change agent, and so I think there's some very interesting. If you start to think about the sectoral connections that might open up, there are some very interesting avenues of work and partnerships that it might suggest.
Robert.
Well, you get a nice summary, and everyone else did. So I don't have too much to say. But maybe I'll stand on a higher order note, and that is, I think urban planning would profit, or is profiting, from greater engagement with social science, and vice versa. Oversimplified, urban planners care mainly about the built environment, and we sociologists study the social world. But the two interact, and I think that we just have to penetrate those boundaries more. I mean, the built environment is important, but it doesn't mean anything absent its interpretation and the social relationships within them. So the social infrastructure, I mean, that's my shtick. That's what I study. The social environment is crucial, but I don't really know anything about the built environment. So that's the future, it seems to me. That's not any great insight, but actually it has pragmatic implications. And the more that you can sort of pursue the social science knowledge, and there I would say we actually know a lot. There's a lot we know, and there's a lot of theory, and there's a lot of new data coming out. It's very creative, and there's a lot of it. So join forces. So you see, even in that, I'm an optimist in the end.
All right. Thank you for your closing comments, and thank you all for coming tonight. Thanks to Roger and Emily and Hupo for organizing this, and on behalf of Hupo, please join me in thanking our panelists for being here this evening.